In 1805, Napoleon Bonaparte set his sights on the one enemy he had never been able to break, Britain. On the windswept shores around Boulogne, he gathered one of the largest invasion forces Europe had seen since Caesar. Nearly 150,000 seasoned soldiers and 7,000 cavalry crowded the camps. In the harbor, thousands of flat-bottomed barges waited to carry them across the channel. His admirals warned the vessels were unstable and would drown the army before the British ever fired a shot. Napoleon brushed the doubts aside. Britain, he believed, could be crushed with speed and audacity. But the channel was guarded by a far greater force than wind and water, the Royal Navy. Unless France could break British control at sea, the invasion army was a giant chained to the French coast. To clear the way, a combined Franco-Spanish fleet under Admiral Pierre-Charles Villeneuve needed to slip out of Cadiz, unite with French squadrons elsewhere, and defeat the British blockading forces. That clash arrived off Cape Trafalgar, a battle that would echo across centuries. Historically, Nelson shattered the Franco-Spanish fleet and ended Napoleon's dream of crossing the Channel forever. But imagine the tide turning the other way. Villeneuve, usually hesitant, broke the blockade earlier than expected. Nelson still intercepted him, but when the British columns punched toward the enemy line to break it apart, Villeneuve didn't panic. He held formation and answered with disciplined volleys from ships packed tightly together. The British advance, usually unstoppable, stalled. HMS Victory was pounded into a wreck. Nelson fell in the fighting. With their commander slain, the British withdrew, and the French-Spanish fleet remained afloat and in control. The channel was open. At Boulogne, drums rolled. French infantry surged toward the barges. The army knew the sea could be deadlier than the British. Only a year earlier, Napoleon had ordered a training exercise during a storm that wrecked dozens of vessels and drowned more than 2,000 men. Still, the Emperor pressed the order. Over 2,000 craft pushed into the rough water. The crossing was chaos. A dozen boats disappeared in the waves. British patrols tried to harass the convoy, but Villeneuve's victorious fleet shielded the passage. One by one, barge after barge grounded on the coast of Kent. The veterans of Italy and Egypt stepped onto English soil. Britain's defenses were stretched thin. Its 116,000 regular soldiers were dispersed across the country, backed by militia and volunteer units that lacked the discipline of Napoleon's hardened professionals. The French secured their beachhead, spread inland, and linked their supply lines. News of their advance reached London. Panic followed. Before the capital could become a battleground, British ministers sued for peace. By early 1806, Britain accepted a treaty that stunned Europe. France dominated the continent unchecked. Britain was forced to recognize Napoleon's new order, and because Britain no longer posed a naval threat, Napoleon had no reason to impose the continental system. Without the blockade, Europe avoided the disastrous spiral that had historically led to the Peninsular War and the invasion of Russia. With his western flank secure, Napoleon turned east. In our timeline, the Russian campaign of 1812 destroyed the Grand Army. But imagine if Napoleon had resisted his instinct for one more dramatic victory. Instead of racing toward Moscow, he halted at Smolensk, fortified the city, stocked it for winter, and waited. The Russians could no longer lure him deeper into wasteland. They were forced to face a massive supplied French army dug in on their frontier. Winter took its toll, but Smolensk held. When spring came, the French marched again, this time in better condition than the starving army of history. At Borodino, Napoleon struck with far more strength. The Imperial Guard broke the Russian lines. Instead of facing a burned Moscow and a frozen retreat, Napoleon withdrew peacefully to his fortified bases. The Tsar, seeing no path to drive the French out, accepted terms. Russia dropped out of the war. With no Russian catastrophe, Austria and Prussia hesitated. They feared French retaliation more than British gold. The Sixth Coalition never truly formed. Napoleon turned south, crushed the British foothold in Iberia, and tightened his grip on Spain. Another turning point followed in 1813. In reality, after the Russian disaster, many German allies deserted Napoleon. At Leipzig, the Battle of Nations, this betrayal doomed him. But imagine if he promised them security, land, and autonomy instead of demanding endless sacrifices. Bavaria, Württemberg, and Saxony stayed loyal. Leipzig unfolded very differently. On October 16th, Napoleon hit Schwarzenberg's Austrians with a coordinated hammer blow. 160,000 French and German troops, supported by 600 guns. Saxon artillery blasted the Prussian flanks. The Allies reeled. Prussian assaults in the north were smashed by stubborn Württemberg and French defenses. On the final day, Napoleon unleashed the Imperial Guard, driving deep into exhausted Allied formations. The coalition collapsed into retreat. Austria sued for peace. Prussia submitted. Russia was spent. Only Britain remained hostile, but it stood alone. By 1815, the map of Europe looked very different. French marshals ruled from Madrid to Naples. Napoleon's satellites held the Rhineland and Poland. Without the drain of Spain or the tragedy of Russia, his empire stood firm. Leipzig, instead of being the grave of French ambition, became the triumph that cemented Napoleon as master of Europe. Yet even in this alternate world, one truth lingered. His power depended on constant victories. Peace required restraint, and restraint had never been his nature. He might have ruled longer, he might even have reshaped Europe more deeply. But whether Napoleon Bonaparte could have secured not just dominance but lasting stability remains the ultimate question.